Tonight in our series, The Last Harvest, looks at farmers coping with a mental health crisis, and October can be the most difficult month.
A disappointing harvest, more debt, all those things combined with depression can leave farmers considering suicide. Our Tom Lydon is here. Tom, what do we know about how big this problem is?
Well, a couple studies have shown farmers may have a suicide rate 2 to 3 times that of the general public. But experts believe even that may be an underestimate because many farmers will disguise suicides as farm accidents. What we do know, and what you'll see tonight, is that farmers are struggling, and there are very few places for them to turn. Miles from the Canadian border, just outside the town of Halleck, you'll find the bean fields that surround the Gilley farm. The land Teresa and her husband Keith Gilley farmed for 30 years. Land she's now left to farm alone.
Hindsight's a lot easier 2020 than when you're living it.
Looking back 2.5 years now, she sees the perfect storm on the horizon. Just as they refinanced and bought more land, soybean prices took a dive. A couple years of bad weather didn't help.
You know, he'd be up in the night and I'd say, come to bed. He'd be looking up something on the internet or on an iPad or something like that, and he'd be sitting in the dark. And that was probably a pretty big sign.
Teresa was bringing in extra income as a Kittson County commissioner and president of the Minnesota Soybean Growers Association. But back at the farm, time was running out.
We were with the neighbors Friday night then, and we get together often with the neighbors, and he was fine, and I almost seemed like he had a sigh of relief, and so I was thinking, okay, things are going to be fine,
But things weren't fine. Saturday morning, she located his cell phone, a dot in the middle of nowhere.
So I pulled it up, and he was 4 minutes away. And 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later, he was still 4 minutes away. And Bryce was here, and I told Bryce, I said, I'm going to go find your dad, find out where he's at, And so it took me right to where he was.
Teresa found Keith that day on a gravel road 4 miles from their home. He had apparently stepped out of his truck and took his own life. The car was even still running. She doesn't know if it was a spontaneous decision or if he'd been planning it. There was no suicide note. The only thing Keith left Teresa with was debt and a lot of questions.
I know people that get notes and then the spouse at least tells them they love them. I don't have that. It's pretty crappy. Because all I get to do is assume.
And left to wonder what would have happened if Keith had called someone like Ted.
Almost always they're shocked that I actually answer my phone. I'll give you a call a little later.
Ted Matthews is a mental health counselor who works with farmers across Minnesota.
Thank you.
At no cost, no paperwork.
Sometimes it's 2 or 3 hours on the phone. Sometimes it's 10 minutes. It just depends on the situation.
You're at an interesting intersection, right? We have a terrible farm economy, and we're also in the middle of a mental health crisis in America.
Yes.
And here you are.
Yeah.
And how many people are doing what you're doing?
Me.
And farmers are often reluctant to seek help. Many finding it hard adjusting to new economic realities beyond their control. They might even convince themselves they're doing their family a favor.
The world's better off without me. I have more life insurance than, I can pay off the farm and all those things. And one of the things that I always stress with people all the time is that how you feel? If your wife committed suicide, would you say, oh, good?
Is there also some guilt that they won't be able to carry on the tradition?
It's an overwhelming guilt. It's an absolute fear that they are failures. And they feel like they are the one that lost the farm after this is the fourth generation, and they're the one losing the farm, and they feel responsible for it, and that puts them into a deep, deep depression.
This was all he's known, and this is all he had such a love for it, and good or bad, this is what he knew. He was fourth generation on this farm, and he talked about that a lot. We're a century farm, which is also a lot of responsibility when you have the generations ahead of you and you think that, you know, I can't be the reason this farm stops.
She told him countless times it would all work out. Keith had skills. All farmers do. He never heard those words. Maybe he couldn't. But there is a timeless question Ted will ask that reframes most problems.
When you say, what's the most important thing in your life? People say family. And then when I say, okay, what are you doing to strengthen your family? They look at me like, what are you talking about?
Teresa
Yes.
knows.
Oh, definitely. I just think that, God, he should be looking at this, and it would just be so fulfilling. But even if we would have quit farming, which we were talking about, chances are we'd probably be still farming these two pieces because they're like the two home pieces.
And there'd be another horizon to look at.
There's always another horizon to look at.
There always is, yeah.
Teresa is still angry Keith took his life. But with the help of friends, she's managing to stitch her own life back together. She is still farming with two of her neighbors and still worries about the harvest for all those other farmers who can't see the horizon.
I want them to understand that it's not the end all. And I sure don't want them to do this to their family.
Ted Matthews, the therapist you just met, is now getting some help. A second rural mental health specialist begins on Tuesday. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture and the U of M are both working on this issue, helping farmers identify and manage stress. But it also helps to get other community members involved, the local sheriff, clergy, veterinarians, so they can recognize the warning signs as well. If you need help or know someone who does, we have a list of resources and links over at the Fox 9 app.
Thanks,
Overwhelming for some people.
Such an important story. So many resources out there.